Hello, everybody. Welcome to another That Word Chat. It's so exciting to see a huge room full of people. It's been a month, so it's great to be actually back doing this again. I've forgotten all the way we do things, but I'm sure we won't have too many technical difficulties. I want to start out, our guest today is Dennis Duncan. His book is kind of the big buzz right now. If you've seen the Washington Post, New York Times, all the media have this have been examining this wonderful book. I'm gonna just ask him to wait just a second. I want to introduce somebody. We have a new, as you saw in the credits, we have a new assistant producer. Sarani Pexon has volunteered to do our live tweeting. So say hello, Sarani, where are you coming to us from?
Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Mark. Yes, my name is, I don't want to correct you,
Sarani,
but it's Sarani.
Keep correcting me. Sarani.
Yeah.
And
sorry.
I said,
if you ever forget, it's just apologize. Sorry, me. Sorry.
Sorry, me.
Yeah.
I have a real hard time with pronunciation, which is really, bad for my line of work, which is, of course, chat show host. But anyway, you're going to be doing our live tweeting. So you feel good about that? You ready to?
Yes, feeling good. Hope I can catch up with our wonderful guest. But yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. All right, now and as you can see, we're in the Sarasota, Florida studio. This is my mother's condo in Sarasota. I asked my mom if she would come and ask a question because we need like another English accent on the show. She said she declined. She's in the next room, but anyway, we're gonna we'll try not to disturb her too much. She might come in and make some tea at some point. Who knows? All right. Anyway, sorry. So I'm rambling on, which is what I do. So we do have a little bit of time for Dennis Duncan, our guest. Let's introduce him. This is the book, which I love. Obviously, the title, Index: A History of the. This is you probably have seen the American, the North America version that's been out now for the past week. This is the British, the UK version, which I got from the British Library because I signed up for a thing. Saw Dennis Duncan do a talk with Susie Dent, and they sent me the book. So very cool. So Dennis, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Yes, and you had the American version. You're in London, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm in my garret with the rain coming through.
Oh, really?
Banging on the window here, and it's late at night. And yes, so this is the American version. Everything exactly the same inside, which maybe we'll come on to why that's an important thing for indexes.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's start with that. Why is it important that? Well, obviously, it's the same index, right? You didn't have to spend the money. The publisher didn't have to spend the money to re-index.
This is an interesting thing, an important thing, and historically, people haven't always realized this. So the index to my book came out in the United Kingdom last autumn, came out in September, whereas in the States, it's just come out a couple of weeks ago in a different publisher, different edition, looks different, but everything inside is the same. And the index was compiled by a lady called Paula, who I think we might see later. So Paula compiled an index to the British edition. Once it had been typeset, once we had page numbers, Paula was then able to use those page numbers to produce an index. Now, it's really important when another edition comes out, either that you keep the page numbers exactly the same, or somebody's going to have to go through it and redo the index, key the index to all of the right pages. So what I have in mind, what I'm thinking about here is before printing, in the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, indexes had already been invented, but there's 200 or 300 years where indexes are around, but printing isn't. So during this period, we're talking about medieval manuscripts, and manuscript, its etymology tells you what it is. It's something that's written by hand. Now, if you're copying out a manuscript, oh, in these days, then every copy of a book is literally copied out by hand.
Yeah.
So if you want a copy of a book, you have to find a book and then take it to a monk in a scriptorium and say, would you mind copying that out for me? And it will be very expensive and it will take months. And while they'll do their very best to copy the words exactly, they aren't thinking at all about making sure they stay on exactly the same pages, partly because you might be copying from, let's say, a big book into a slightly smaller book. You see what I mean? Now, your job is to make sure the words stay the same, but if the guy's just given you a smaller book, that means that the pagination is not going to stay the same. So this is a problem with indexes. Indexes work for that copy of the book, but once you start to move beyond that copy of the book, you have a problem. You can't really use page numbers. So there's a time when I was researching this book, I found a history book in a library in Cambridge, St John's College Library, very big old history book written in the 1380s, and it's a copy of a history book from the 1350s. And it's been copied out, and at the end, after hundreds of pages, the monk signs it. He says, John Lutton copied out this book. John Lutton of Chester, I think he says, copied out this book. And then he realizes, oh, he's still got to do the index. So he turns the page and he copies out the index. But John Lutton of Chester in the 1380s doesn't really know what an index is. So he copies out the page numbers, which don't work. So you go to this history book, you look something up in the index and it tells you, okay, Alexander the Great arrived at Tyre in his conquest of Tyre, page 77. Turn to page 77 and says nothing about the city of Tyre. In fact, it says nothing at all about Alexander the Great, and he's died about 6 pages ago. Like, what's going on here? Because the whole book is like when you have a web page, a page full of links, and every time you click on a link, it says 404, page not found. Poor old John Lutton doesn't realize that either you've got to redo the index or you've got to copy it out, keeping the same pagination. So sorry, that's a long-winded way of saying the English edition and the UK edition are both able to use Paula's index because they kept the inside exactly the same.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating, and the book is full of those fascinating little tidbits about things that we take for granted now. Although now, you know, when I pick up a Kindle book, I can turn to page 612, which is really page 47. It's probably not exactly how it works, but it doesn't relate to the original book. So are we getting back into a problem with is technology?
We really are. It's like the medieval manuscript problem that Kindle's design is what we call reflowable, and that's great because you can change the typefaces. My daughter is dyslexic, so there's a typeface called Dyslexic that works for her. We can make pages bigger if we're long-sighted or things like that. The page is reflowable, and so suddenly you can click a button and your page 62 becomes page 124 or something like that. But it does mean that things that are keyed, indexes that Paula has done that are keyed to pages, don't work anymore. So it might be worth talking to an indexer or to Paula about what the solutions are. I mean, we're living in the age of the hyperlink. It shouldn't be a problem, but it really is.
Right. Well, yeah, and I suppose that's another thing that you know, with hyperlinks and in a I don't even know. We should, you're right. We should get Paula on. I said we'd bring Paula on. We talked to you for a while, but if we're going to talk about Paula, we really should have her here with us. Paula Clarke Bain is you know her. She's a friend of the show. She won second place in our word puzzle episode. She had an amazing run. And she's a supporter.
Is that right, Paula? Sorry, we're going a little bit off topic, but what was that about?
Yeah, it was sort of crossword puzzle setters did a special word chat a couple of months ago, was it?
Yeah.
So I joined in and I won a mug for coming runner that mug that Heather's holding up now. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't have my mug to show because I'm at this Florida studios, but yeah, it was an exciting, you know, and it didn't bother me at all that that our two top winners were from Manchester and Toronto, Canada, and I had to pay postage for internationally, which isn't so bad. I guess it's not so bad when you're in England and you're mailing it to somewhere, but here it does seem to cost an arm and a leg. But that's further off topic. But I think if anybody who's familiar with the show knows that there is no such thing as off topic. So was the index we see a lot of books for the American edition, they'll change spellings, and maybe that doesn't change page numbers. Do they at least do that for this book?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that they didn't. I should have a quick look through the American edition. I was thinking about that. Would it, and could something as small as the very slight changes between US and British spelling actually throw Paula's index out? I don't think they updated it because they didn't send me a new set of proofs. So I suspect they just kept everything
the same,
exactly,
isn't it? I think it's the same
as was.
Okay, well, I found a travelogue. Is travelogue with a U anyway? Is that a British spelling?
Spell it with a UE. I think maybe you would just spell end it with a G.
Oh, and there's also humor right below that on page 159. So anyway, but then of course you would have to change the spellings in the index. There's probably some British spellings in the index. Now you mentioned an interesting thing about the Italian before the show we were talking.
Well, that's right. So I was just talking about that they didn't have to redo Paula's index for the US edition of the book, but for translations they do, because the translation really is going to throw the pagination off. So a couple of differences with the Italian edition. I might come to the second one afterwards, but the first is that the index had to be translated. Ordinarily, I think this doesn't happen. Ordinarily, when you have a translation of a book, you would just get somebody to compile a new index rather than to take an index and actually translate it, treat it as if it were part of the text for translation. It might be worth asking Paula to say something about why this was a special case index that needed translation. Paula, you might work in some of your cryptic crossword skills here.
I think because we'll probably come on to sort of humor in the index, but there's quite a lot of strange things going on in this index once you start looking at it, because Dennis asked me to put lots of humor in and personality and
humor with a U. I specifically said, could you put some humor in with a U?
Yeah, page 320.
Yeah,
humor with a U.
There'll be a problem if you put too much humor in it.
Is this humor C index wit? So, and we can, and you maybe Paula, we'll stick with Paula. Maybe you would explain that as well.
Well, yeah, there's so many unusual things in it that I think they wanted to preserve those things rather than have it re-indexed, because if you have it re-indexed by somebody, there are going to be differences, because in some ways it's quite subjective. Indexing, so a different indexer will do a different index. There will be things in common to all the indexes, and they could all be as good as each other, but they are not going to be the same. So the translator is Chiara Buffer, I think.
That's right.
Yeah, and she's translated the index, and the jokes that wouldn't directly translate, she's kind of found a way to make them work in Italian as well. She's done an amazing job. But I think it is quite a special case that they've translated the whole thing rather than re-indexed it.
Right. So
one other thing to say about the Italian edition. So in my book, if you read it in English, there's actually two indexes at the back. And one of the things I wanted to show was the difference between Paula. Paula says that the index is quite a subjective thing. And I've spoken to Paula before, and she says when the Society of Indexers have their annual conference, sometimes it's a 2-day conference, and one of the things they do is they all take the same text and produce an index, just maybe a chapter or something, just to then get together and see how they did it and see what the differences are. An index produced by a human is a subjective thing, but there is software, computer software, designed to save publishers money, save time by you run a PDF through it and it will produce an index. And one of the things I wanted to do was show that how in in our time, in 2021, 22, that software is still not very good. You should still get Paula to do your index rather than just getting a computer to do it. So I ran the book through some of this software. And I like that. I'm pleased. I think that works really well. I'll say a bit more about it in a sec. But we couldn't do that for the Italian edition. So there isn't software that works with Italian. You can do it in English, and we found Dutch. But the one thing that the Italian edition lacks is the computer index. So I think any jokes relating to that had to be excised from the index. There are various bits of software that do it. So the first time I thought, I'm going to get computer software to I sound a bit silly saying this, but I wanted to show how it's not very good. I wanted the humans to win. So I ran the book through the first piece of indexing software I could find, and it was atrocious. And I really laughed, and I showed it to Paula, and I showed it to my publisher, and we said, oh, this is great, because one of the people who invents the index, a Dominican friar in the early 13th century, a man called Hugh of Saint-Cher, C-H-E-R, it's a village in southwest France. Hugh of Saint-Cher is a key character inventing the index in the Middle Ages. In the computerized index, it had an entry for sure, as in sure, you know, Sonny and Cher, do you believe in life after love? Sure. And I was looking through this index going, I don't think I mentioned sure, but she turns up like on dozens of pages in the early chapters of this book. And I really thought, oh, this is great. This is a really nice example of how the humans win. And gradually, I think there was a kind of guilt that this index was so bad. I thought that can't be the best representative of the state of the art in automated computing. This is so silly. And so I started to actually lose sleep about it, going to bed at night thinking, I can't bring a book out. If I'm supposed to show how computers aren't that good, I need to get the very best.
Yeah.
And so I had to do some research and had to pay for some expensive software, which still wasn't as good as Paula, but at least could tell the difference between Hugh and
But
yeah, there's a moral obligation to use some good software rather than the funny software.
Sure, but and of course the brief index of computer generated, and I mean it's not useful. It's just not very useful, right?
Yeah. So what it does is it. I mean, firstly, it can't identify concepts. It can only identify words. So if you want to know all the times I say alas, then brilliant, but you probably don't. And the things that Paula's index can do is identify times when I'm talking about a concept without actually naming it. I suppose that the example I feel I'm repeating myself, I'm saying this to somebody before, but if you're reading a book and it starts talking about Jackson Pollock, then you'll expect to find Pollock, Jackson in the index. But if a human's indexing it, if Paula's indexing it, she might well put abstract expressionism in the index as well, even if you haven't used that word, even if I haven't used that word, because she's thinking people might look up that. They might, where's that section where he talks about abstract expressionism? Now, the software won't do that. The software can't make that leap between things you didn't say, but were talking about, if you like. So the software index is sort of interesting, but all it does is it picks out words, or occasionally tries to pick out phrases. Sometimes they're a bit silly. When it tries to be clever, you can see all of the times that I say Aesop's fables. That might be useful. But admonishment creeping, page 131, or adjustment small, page 105.
No, it really does speak to the art, and I was going to ask you and Paula both, you know, is it getting better? Are we going to see that it's more useful thing? But really, just the example you gave, you know, artificial intelligence is, you know, probably at least a generation away from putting Jackson Pollock in context.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, Google does it a bit, and is getting better at it. Is learning what do you mean? Where do you live? What kinds of things are you interested in? So, I mean, the example I give in the book is of the word cow. Now, cow, I think I'm not a New England fisherman, but I believe if I was an angler in New England, then there's a certain type of fish whose slang name is a cow. I caught a really big cow when I went out fishing. If you've done a lot, if Google knows that you live in New England and you do a lot of searches for fishing, then when you type catch a cow, it's going to bring you up the correct set of results. If you live in London like me and you type catch a cow, you get some footage of a farmer in Thailand whose cow fell into a stream. He has to get it out. So that sort of intuition is starting to creep in. I mustn't be too mean about the computers, and certainly Google is at the forefront of doing that sort of intuitive understanding of what you mean when it could be ambiguous.
Yeah.
If you're jumping through a PDF with Control F, it's got no idea. Yeah, you can spell it wrong and it won't find it.
Right. Yeah. So, I think there, and I had a different question, but I'll stick with that. There is the electronic versions of books it's so incredibly useful from a research perspective to be able to do a Control F and find every instance, even if every instance is, even if 1 in 10 are useful, you're making sure you're not missing something. Whereas an human index is limited by pages. I suppose I don't know. Is Paula, when you give it an index, are you told keep it to this length?
Sometimes, if I'm doing one directly for a publisher, yes. Sometimes I'll say you've got 8 pages, you've got 900 lines or something like that. And sometimes it's nowhere near enough. So that's quite difficult at the editing stage because you're taking things out. You think, I don't want to take anything out of this because I think it's all useful. But you're trying to judge which bits to take out. When you're saying about the Control F and the computer indexing, that's very good at word spotting. It's very good at making a concordance rather than an index. And if you do a search for a word that you want in an ebook or whatever, you might get, I don't know, 200 results. But it's the job of the indexer when they're making an index to look through those and put them in some kind of different subheadings and tell you what's going on, rather than making you look through 200 instances to try and find what you want. It's the job of the indexer to think, what is the reader going to want to know about this? What is it actually saying about this word, about indexes, or about whatever the main topic of the book is? And that's where we come in, really, rather than the computer search.
Can I jump in? What's interesting about this is that the 2 types of index we're talking about, the subject index that thinks, well, what's the subject under discussion here, even if they use different words for it? What's the sort of topic? Conceptual index. And the concordance, as Paula called it, the word index, which is simply, well, what words are used here? Both arrive at exactly the same time. They're both invented around about the year 1230. So the idea that we need to search books in a more efficient way, we need to read faster, is absolutely in the air in the early 13th century. And 2 different people invent slightly different versions of the index. The concordance then is the one that gets invented by Scher on the outskirts of France in the Dominican friary, and it's really useful. They take the Bible, the friars at Saint-Jacques take the entire Latin Bible and just rearrange the words into alphabetical order. It's got about 10,000 head words. It's got about 130,000 locations. For each word, they give you every instance that it's used. So certain words, the word a, which we usually translate as alas, gets used 4 times. The word sin gets you can pages after pages of locators telling you the book and the chapter and the subsection, the 7th of the chapter that it appears in. And that's really useful. I mean, this is essentially, they've invented the Control F search for the Bible. Right. And we shouldn't write it off. It's incredibly influential for writing sermons. This is what it's used for in the late Middle Ages. This is what we can do with the Bible if we can suddenly jump around. If we have a memory aid that will tell us, you want to do that sermon about bread. Okay, well, you're going to start off with the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. Then you're going to jump, you're going to pivot into the Old Testament with the manna from heaven. Then you're going to jump back to the New Testament and the feeding of the 5,000. Suddenly your sermon is really engaging. People are being excited by the way that you seem to have the Bible at your fingertips, but you've been able to write it very quickly by just looking up the term panis in the index. So that Control F thing is massively useful, is massively influential, and it's also 800 years old.
Yeah, but again, you're not going to search for, you're searching in Latin or Greek, but in English, if you search for bread, you're not going to get manna. Are you going to get loaves and fishes? I don't know. So you give us this daily bread, but you don't get those other contexts maybe that are useful also.
That's true. You might, yeah. I mean, it's still like you're doing university work. You might have to do a little bit of tweaking your search. Definitely, yeah. Yeah, interesting. So, all right. So the question I've been meaning to ask ever since I first picked this book up, the title. I love the title. Absolutely can't say how much the title is wonderful. Index: A History of the. Did you come up with the title one day and think, oh, I had to write a history of the index because that's such a great title, or how did the title come along? Oh man, the title came about halfway through. It was originally going to be an academic book. I had a long research project at Oxford. I had an office in the Bodleian Library at Oxford for 3 years where I was researching this book, and I thought that I would publish it with an academic press. It would sell 200 copies to academic libraries, but the people who really needed to know the history of the index would have it. And it was going to be called something like A History of the English Book Index or something, something like that. And I had a few other ideas. I thought, because there's this parallel story, which I'll talk about later, about how the index has always had alongside it people who resist it, people who think that indexes are sort of killing off our ability to read books properly. That goes back 600 years. And so I thought, well, I might call it Table of Discontents. Will that work?
Okay.
And that, but I thought, no, really, it's going to be called A History of the Book Index. But at some point, I'd done a conference. The thing was quite established in the academic community, and some other people got to hear about it. There was a day I wrote something for an English literary newspaper called the Times Literary Supplement about indexes, and very quickly I got people getting in touch, publishers getting in touch with me. Academics, we don't get that. We chase publishers because please publish my book, and they say no, but they're the gatekeepers that we're all terrified of. And suddenly I just did this thing about the history of indexes, and that afternoon, ping, my email went, and it was some publisher, and then 20 minutes later, ping, somebody else saying, you're doing a book about the index. Have you got anywhere to publish it? And a third one came that afternoon. And then I thought, oh, right. Well, I hadn't really considered that anyone would be interested in this outside a very, very small community. So that was really fun and surprising. And what it meant for me was that I slightly changed the tone of the book, it became a little bit less dry. A few of the anecdotes get a bit more space. When I talk about Hugh of Saint-Cher, you don't have to Wikipedia him because I put a little bit of back, basically character and anecdote get slightly turned up on the dial there. And at that point, I thought, oh, you know what? It'd be really funny to call it Index, A History of the. So it was kind of at a halfway stage where I thought, oh, I can have some fun with this. This doesn't have to be the bibliographic dry as dust thing. We can start to introduce the characters. We can have use a slightly more anecdotal way of narrating this story, and it can have a funny title. Yeah,
that's right, and it makes it. I think. I mean, a good title is certainly sets a tone for the book, and it's gotten. I mean, it seems like it's everywhere this week. I mean, obviously I'm looking out for it, so I see it, but the New York Review of Books and Washington Post had a big write-up. I saw the Guardian did it a few months ago with the UK edition. What's it been like? I mean, has it been, are your academic friends jealous, or do they sneer at your sudden popularity?
It's been really nice, but I cannot describe to you what it's like. It's just very, very strange. I really didn't sort of anticipate this. And then it came out in the UK, and really lots of national newspapers wrote about it and said very nice things about it, which was delightful and fun and surprising. And then it happened in the States. And I just feel, like I say, that the project was initially a thing that I thought I'd do as a sort of minor academic service that would be useful for, I don't know, a coterie of a couple of dozen of my immediate peers who'd be interested in this. So it feels like I can't really get over. I can't stop laughing. The whole thing is bizarre and delightful. It feels like every time, like, you know, when you climb a mountain, you get to the top, but you realize that there's another peak that's even higher, like beyond that. How many people seriously can honestly be interested in the history of the index? Because you're very kind and say that it has jokes in it. But at root, it still is literally a history of the book index.
Well, I mean, I think, I travel in circles where people are interested in the how an index comes together and, you know, the dynamics of it. One you talk about index resistors, you know, anytime somebody comes to me who's a self-publishing author writing nonfiction, I have to convince them, you know, you need an index for this. And because, I don't want to pay that expense as well. But of course, you can't. I mean, the worst thing in the world is picking up a nonfiction book and looking in the back and there's nothing there.
That's absolutely true. Oh, the one other thing that I would say in the book's defense, I suppose, or the one way that I can sort of rationalize why they might be interested in it is the modern sort of technological aspect of it, that we do live, I think in the book I call it, in the age of search. So it's 10 o'clock here, it's about 5 o'clock, it's the end of your working day in the States, or if you're on the West Coast, it's about lunchtime. I bet there's not a single one of you here who hasn't used a search engine, probably Google at least once, probably several dozen times already today. And Google is an index. So Google say this, the way that Google works is that it goes off and searches the internet. We know that searches every web page, but it doesn't do that when you type your search term in. It does that all day and all night, all of the time. And the things that it finds, it puts into tables, various tables, some of them alphabetical. And when you type in your search terms, Google doesn't go and search the internet, it searches its index of the internet. So all of the stuff that we do when we want to know where that restaurant is, or when we're watching football, we want to know who did he used to play for, or a movie, what was she in, I thought he was dead, all of that kind of stuff. We have these sort of itchy trigger fingers constantly searching for information. Information has never been more available, and that's because of the universal indexes behind the search engines. And so I suppose that that's the one way I can sort of rationalize why we're interested in the history of search. I suppose the book's not just a history of index; it's a history of search, a sort of backstory of the current moment.
I'm going to disagree with that. I think people who are, I think it's interesting to consider Google as sort of a continuation of the story. Which it is. I mean, Google is as you say, it's an index, it's contextual. They actually make some effort. It's not just a keyword search. They make a huge effort to make it, if I look up a restaurant, it's going to tell me the local one, not one in Manchester. But I don't know if I think it maybe people are picking this up because they're interested in that familiar thing that maybe they haven't considered, that goes back, that has this wonderful long history. I think it's one reason why books are still so popular, where, 15 years ago we thought, are we going to, is this the death of the book? But apparently it's not. So that's my one disagreement with you.
But so people might like it because it's a sort of celebration of the book, the actual old copy medium of the book.
Right, and we've all dealt with indexes since we were children, and really probably not given a lot of thought to them along the way. I wanted to ask Paula the same question about the notoriety, because I mean, an index, I'm a copy editor. I'm not used to people calling me out, and people don't come up to me and say, "Oh, I read that book. That was so well copy edited." And indexers are maybe even more anonymous.
Well, there's two ways of looking at that, because I started out as a proofreader and copy editor and then trained up as an indexer. And if you're a really brilliant proofreader or copy editor, you're essentially invisible, aren't you? It's just a really well-written book, well-structured book, and you've done the work, and people don't notice errors in it because there aren't errors in it. Whereas with indexing, you do get to create, you know, the last 10 pages of a book or the last 20 pages of a book. And I really like that about it, that you've made something and it's at the back of the book and it's out there. And this one in particular, it's got much more of me in it than any index I've ever done before, deliberately, because that's what we were trying to make a few points and Dennis wanted that. And I'm in the book, as Dennis talks about me in the book, so I've had to put myself in the index as well, and sort of interject into the index and all sorts of things going on, which is a bit unusual there. But I think we often don't get acknowledged either. I mean, proofreaders and copy editors often are just not mentioned in the acknowledgement. I thank everybody who's I've ever met to do this book, but you know, not the person who edited it or proofread it or created the last 20 pages of it. But it's very nice when you do get an acknowledgement. But this one, yes, I've definitely, it's drawn attention to itself, this index, and it's drawn attention to the indexer. But that's kind of what we wanted to do. It would have been a missed opportunity not to do something a bit different with it, considering what the subject of the book is. And so we were trying to reflect a few of the stories that Dennis brings up in the book and put some of those kind of ideas into the index.
Paula, do you want to tell us, give us a few examples, tell us a bit about what you did with it, with reference to your life as a crossword setter too.
Okay. It was very nice with us. Dennis gave me a brief that I could pretty much have license to play, and we needed a good base index, a good scholarly index that people could use, and people could use to navigate the book. But he also wanted lots of humor in it, lots of index jokes in it, lots of indexer personality in it. He said about, I've been training to be a cryptic crossword setter as well. And Dennis does mention anagrams in the book, and he does mention acrostics in the book. So I thought, well, that's an opportunity to put some in to the index. So there is an anagram of my name in there. There's one of Dennis's name in there. There's an acrostic in the subheadings under my name. And there's all these, I think there's a few anagrams in there actually. But there's different index jokes, there's different playing with cross references, sending the reader the wrong way, serial cross references where they just go on and on and on, and you don't go straight to the target, ones that go around in circles.
There's an incredible thing you did, didn't you? But Lewis Carroll invented what we call word golf. Isn't that right? Where you take, say, a four-letter word, like word, and then you take another word like golf, and you have to get from the first word to the second word using a chain of proper sort of lexical words. And because we talk about Lewis Carroll in the book, I think, Paula, you took it on yourself to use cross references to do I can't remember where you go from and where you end up, but there is a performance of word golf in the index.
I do love the work that kind of came up when I'd done the initial draft, and we had a Zoom talk about that and discuss things. And that came up because Carroll's in the book and because Nabokov's Pale Fire is in the book. So word golf is relevant to both of those in different ways. So I think Dennis said it'd be nice to have some kind of word golf going on in the index. So I sort of looked it up a bit, and I've taken the first word golf that Lewis Carroll published, which is head to tail, and it changes one letter each time. And then I've added sort of tail back to head in the index. So you just end up going round and round, sort of changing one letter each time. But because it's sort of relevant to Carroll as well, and it's relevant to Pale Fire, it was like right at the end before we sent it off, and it was just a really nice, that's one of my favorite parts of the index actually.
My favorite bits are the bits where you're there. You have some entries where you sort of put in square brackets Paula Clarke Bain, and so there's an entry for indexers, poor remuneration of, And and so I think you might you might have initialed that one, and certain other ones, like when it's you versus the computer index a few pages earlier, you're quite snarky about it. There's a real sort of insertion of very explicit personality there, which
yeah,
I think
again I was trying to sort of channel some of the stories of some of the indexes and some of the snarky indexes of the past that Dennis talks about in the book, where they're up to their own devices in the back of the book, and they're sometimes that's against the author's original intention, or it's, and I didn't want to be too snarky about Dennis because it's a great book and I like Dennis, but yes, the the computer index, I could be snarky about that.
It's really important that you're there, and you, A, sort of as a named thing, and B, for your personality, because I mean the point of the indexes have historically been an anonymous profession. Like you say, it's one of those things that the sort of function jobs where if it's done well, then you don't notice. Nobody ever says, oh, that's a really unblocked drain, you know, but they will stay in a really stinky room if it's not. And so I think it's really important to sort of turn those tables and in this instance sort of make a plea for the non-anonymous. What's the antonym of anonymous? For the word people here, is it nimus or
Nimus, yes, nimus.
Interesting. Yeah, it could be. When I first got the book, the first thing I did was go to the index. It's a book about indexes. You know, maybe I looked at no, I think I pretty much went to the index first because I thought, what's a book about indexes? Let's just check out the index. And I do. I actually, when I get books, I very often go to the back and just skim the index, not in any sort of a way to glean information from it, but just to get a sense of the book. And I didn't know Paula at the time, but of course, as the more I looked at the index, the more I said, wait a second, and kept going and kept looking at all these interesting little quirky things. And then I noticed the asides where the indexer herself had comments on it. So anyway, so get it just for the index, and then
can I say something about the way that you went to the index first? So I mentioned earlier this age-old paranoia. So it's something that is as old as the index itself, which is doomsayers saying, oh dear, now we have this tool which summarizes the book. Nobody's going to read properly anymore. People aren't going to take the time to actually read books. So as far back as you want to go, you can go back 500 years, and Erasmus is saying this. I suggest you can go back to the 1480s, and William Caxton, the first English printer, is already worrying a bit about putting an index in a book. He calls the index to one of his books the remembrance. And I think the suggestion there is, well, it's all very well if you've read the book and you're using the index to remember what's in it, but you don't make the mistake of thinking, well, I can do that first and then maybe not bother with the index. So that I think the American phrase is the Washington read. So this idea that from the 70s onwards, politicians in Washington would go into bookstores and pull down the latest political memoir, just flick to the back and see if they were in it. Oh. And if they are, they buy it. And if they're not, they just put it back on the shelf and they don't need it. So this business about turning to the back is the source of this anxiety constantly that we get for hundreds and hundreds of years, which has its sort of modern avatar in the idea, is Google making us stupid? Are we not proper readers anymore because we look everything up? And so I think that's one of the sort of themes that runs through it. But the story about that I think I heard most when I was putting the book together, telling people I'm writing a history of the index. Many people would say, have you heard the story about Norman Mailer and William F. Buckley? And the story is this. William F. Buckley is a right-wing conservative celebrity in the mid-60s. In 1966, there's the race for the election for mayor of New York. And Buckley enters it at quite a late date, and he loses. He was never expecting to win, but he did it as a kind of publicity stunt. But also, I think his entry into it and the fact that he livened up the campaign probably drew the vote towards the right. Republican candidate won in the end. But Buckley then goes away and writes an account of his publicity stunt running for mayor, and it's called The Unmaking of a Mayor. And while he's writing it, he writes to his friend, his sort of frenemy, Norman Mailer. They know each other. They're both sort of public intellectuals, but they have a sort of scrappy relationship. And he says to Mailer, "Do you mind if I quote some of our correspondence in the book?" And Mailer says, "No, don't want you to." And Buckley mentions that in the book. He doesn't quote the correspondence, but he quotes the fact that he fell out a little bit with Mailer. When the book comes out, what Buckley does is he sends a copy to Norman Mailer. You know, as you do, your book comes out, you send it to your friends and acquaintances. And at the back, in the index under Mailer Norman, page 321, in red biro, he writes, "Hi," because he knows that the first thing that Norman Mailer is going to do is turn to the back to see if he's in it. And that little phrase, that "hi" in red biro, is kind of pointing the finger, going, "This is a very narcissistic thing you're doing here. I can see you." And
you mentioned academics. I mean, it's not just ego thing. It's, if you're an academic, you want to know if you want to know right away if you're in the book, because you may have to defend what the person said about you, for one thing.
Tell you what, though, one thing about that, when you do a book, all of the images, all of the illustrations have to be paid for. It's a very expensive thing to bring out a book with illustrations. So all of the archives, all of the libraries, everything you take a photo of, or everything you ask them to take a photo of, that all needs to be cleared, and there's a little charge for all of that. And once you've paid for all the photos, anything that you use where the author has died within the last 70 years, either you need to pay the author, or you need to pay the author's estate if they died within 70 years. So the photograph of the back of Norman Mailer's book that says "Hi," it's at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. And I got permission from the Ransom Center to use it, but because it's got Buckley's handwriting, it also counts as a William Buckley manuscript. So I needed to clear it with William Buckley's estate. He died 15 years ago, but I wrote to his son, Christopher Buckley, to say, "Look, this is some unpublished writing, one word, but unpublished manuscript by your father. Would you mind if I use it in the book?" There's a bit of back and forth about it, but he was very gracious, and he said, "Yep, sure, that's fine. You can use that. One stipulation, though, when the book comes out, please could you send me a copy?" So it came off the presses in America about a month ago, and I got my publisher to send him a copy. But before we sent it out, we just wrote in red biro alongside his dad's name, "Hi." Just to make sure that stays fresh.
Yeah, we have some questions that have been stacking up a little bit in the room. So let's go to some questions from our audience today.
Yes, we have 3. First up is Judy. Judy, if you want to unmute and ask.
Hey, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. So first I want to say I'm taking the Berkeley course in indexing right now, about 4/5 of the way through. Wow. And I have to say, I've been talking about what people know. I don't think I've yet met a person that I told them I'm studying book indexing and they have any idea what I'm talking about. So yeah, and I have to say, I hadn't really thought about it. So, and I'll also say it is incredibly difficult. I cannot believe how challenging. It's wonderful, but it is hard stuff. My question has to do with when we were talking about finding things in digital text. So where does embedded indexing come in, and how can that help with finding things in text, and in what kind of areas would embedded indexing simply not work?
That's a really good question. I think it's a question for Paula, and I wonder if I could also add an extra question for Paula, which is why don't we have more embedded indexing, since people read books on Kindles and it's something that can be done?
Costs, basically. Publishers won't pay for it. We can do it. There's some very big publishers that have been using it for about 10 years, mainly Cambridge.
Oh, sorry, should we just say what embedded indexing
Right,
is?
Embedded indexing is it's often done in the Word document rather than the PDF proofs, and you're actually working in the manuscript. You are anchoring entries within the text, so that when that format changes, if it goes into proofs or if it goes into an ebook or another format, your entry is anchored within a point in the text. So they can then generate the index, and the page numbers or the locators will be correct, whatever format,
so you're not stuck. So when we were talking earlier about Kindles being reflowable, you can make it have a load of text on the page or not very much text on the page. And that's not a problem because the index is no longer keyed to page numbers, but it's keyed to actually moments in the text.
Yeah, actual words in the text sometimes. So if you're doing an index normally from page proofs, it's going to be somewhere on that page. It's going to be somewhere on page 25. You could find it. But with an embedded index, you are anchoring it to the paragraph or to the line or to the word sometimes, and that will move however that text changes, how it reflows. It should move and work, and it will update correctly. So there's a couple of publishers that use it, but that technology has been around for, I don't know, 10, 15 years, and there's still not many publishers will go for it at all. I think we considered doing one for this index, and because the publisher it first came out with, they don't work that way, so we couldn't do it. It would have been nice to do it.
It's funny, isn't it? I feel slightly ashamed in case somebody's going to ask me. One day somebody will ask me, I read your book on the Kindle, why is the index so terrible? You know,
it won't work as it could do. We could have made it work much better than that.
Paula, for you, what's the difference in terms of time, and therefore for the publisher, what's the difference in terms of cost in commissioning an embedded index?
It's more complicated. It takes a bit longer. It requires different software. It costs more, and that's why
it takes a bit longer, or takes massively longer.
The more you train in it, the quicker you get. But it's more complicated because you've got the whole process and method of doing an index, plus having to do it as an embedded index, which is an extra step, and it's a slightly different mindset, and tagging it to the exact place in the text. The theory behind it's the same, but it does take longer. It is more complex, and not many.
There is one advantage, isn't there, for publishers, which is, as you say, the indexer then is working from the Word document. So everyone sends in, instead of manuscripts, they send in Word documents, and then these get turned into PDFs. These get typeset into PDFs, at which point your page number becomes static, and then the indexer can start working very late in the publishing cycle, because they need to wait for those page numbers for the page to become static and the page numbers to be generated. Whereas with an embedded index, as long as you finalize the text, you can start working while it's being typeset.
That's it. But with the main publisher who uses it, I will be indexing a text while somebody else is copy editing the Word manuscript, because it's done at that stage.
So it can
copy
actually
edits and the index get combined at proofreading stage, and then it'll be proofread. But it's done at a whole stage earlier. It's not done at proofreading stage anymore. It's done at copy editing stage.
Yeah,
that's spectacular. That actually ties pretty directly into our second question, which, Alexandra, if you want to ask, because I feel like Paula's going to be able to expand on it really well.
Well, I just want to say, as an indexer, I am so thrilled. You have, the two of you, I would say single-handedly, but both of you have raised the profession of indexing, and it's just fantastic. It's amazing. As Judy said, usually people say, oh, what's an indexer? But now, now lots of people know. And if I could also just say, in response to Paula's, I have done embedded indexing, but more for independent publishers. I think or independent authors. I think the publishers have such a static workflow that they can't quite shift. But for independent authors, I've done in fact, I've done more of my embedded indexing for independent authors, and I do it from InDesign, not from Word, but same idea. Anyway, all of this to say, my question is, at what point, Dennis, in your process, did you contact Paula? That's my real question.
I quite early on, quite a long time before the book was ready, and I think I had Paula in mind for a while. I've done a few books. I think I've done 3 books where I've used a Society of Indexers indexer, And I did one book where I didn't have a say and it got done by a computer, which is why I had it in mind.
Really?
I'm going to call that out because it was so rubbish. It did a thing. It obviously just pulled out proper names, right? So anything that started with a capital like ended up in the index, including some words that were common nouns but just occurred at the start of sentences. I mean, this is 4 or 5 years ago, but it was really stupid software. But I'd done 2 books prior to this one where I used a Society of Indexers indexer, and at each point choosing them was I think I just did the sensible thing. I did a book that was on 20th century French literature, so I used the Society of Indexers webpage to find somebody who had French, because I thought, well, that would be important for them to fully understand the text, to know where people fit. And she did a great job. And then my friend Adam Smythe and I did a book 2 or 3 years ago called Book Parts, which was quite similar to this book, a history of dust jackets and title pages and tables of contents and stuff like that. But a lot of these parts of the book emerged during the Renaissance, emerged during the sort of 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th century, and at a point when a lot of books were in Latin. And so there's quite a lot of Latin in this book. And so again, I used the webpage to find somebody who was a classicist, because I wanted them to get these details right. You know, this is the guidance that I've had from being to Society of Indexers conferences, which is, you know, if you're doing a gardening book, make sure you choose somebody who does gardening.
So you've gone to Society of Indexers is the UK indexing society, and you've gone to their conferences just as sort of as you were researching this book, or what was your motivation?
Right. As a sort of interested observer. And at one of those, I went to the pub afterwards, and a few people went to the pub, one of whom was Paula, and this was quite a while ago. But I did sort of clock, oh, Paula, she's quite good fun. And I think she was also she was on the board. Were you a comm secretary or something for the society? And that really was the intersection of what I was looking for. I wanted somebody, I think it was important for this book, Alex, to have somebody who had some status within the community. You know, why did you choose them? Well, she was on the board, you know, rather than, it needed to have an indexer with a bit of status. But also I'd been out drinking with her and thought she's funny, and I thought, oh good, she's in that sort of Venn diagram of
mentality.
It would do a funny job, but also people wouldn't go, why has he chosen her? Sorry, Paula, that sounds weird. Is that all right? So, and then I actually think I got in touch with Paula maybe 18 months before the book was finished and said, you know, I'm doing this book, would you be prepared to do it? So quite an early stage, before she even got a long time before she got anywhere near the sort of final chapters.
And a sort of a non sequitur. I'm sorry, go ahead, Paul. I didn't mean to.
No, I was just going to sort of just follow up to that a bit, saying obviously a lot of indexers wanted to do this book as well, so I'm sure more than one expressed an interest in doing it. So it's a dream of a job. It was a very, very strange job, a very meta job, trying to you're indexing a book about book indexes and about indexers, and you're in it yourself, and it's a very, very strange experience indexing it. And then, as you said, with the reception it's just gone bizarre, and it's got even more bizarre now it's out in the US. It's just gone quite nuts the last week or so.
Bizarre squared, isn't it? But I'm really happy that it's gone well for you, Paul, because one of the things that you've mentioned is a sort of what's called imposter syndrome, or like within your community, it was a book that people would sort of pay attention to, and then so you're really sort of exposing yourself as an indexer to the indexing community. And I'm very, very pleased that I hope it's gone all right. Is that okay? Has it?
I hope it's gone all right as well. But yeah, as an indexer, you are trying to put your head in the mind of the reader or the readerships. So I knew for this book there'd be people coming to it who were sort of scholarly academic readers. There'd be people who knew pretty much nothing about indexes because it was a trade book in the UK. But I also knew there'd be a lot of my colleagues and indexers reading this, and colleagues overseas in the indexing societies, and that is quite a pressure. And I certainly did feel it and do feel it. And yes, it's nice when they say nice things about it.
The index is in the blurb on the back. There should be more of that.
Just a non sequitur. I just noticed. I don't know if this is new, Paula. Your Twitter, the image on your Twitter page is you've done an index of yourself.
That's been there a lot. That's been there about 10 years actually.
Is it really?
Yeah, it's on my website. Yeah, it's like a CV. Like a CV in index form.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, it's wonderful. And you mentioned pubs as what was the word?
That is in
yeah.
Inordinate fondness or something. Yeah.
Inordinate fondness of pubs. Okay, we're sort of over time. I think we have one more question, then but we should really wrap up.
We do. We have one last question, which I think will be a great divergence and final things to chat about. Our Miss Mary Norris.
Speaking of the back of the book, right?
There. I had the great pleasure of reading this early on because we share an editor at Norton. And so I got it last summer to read in order to blurb. And I refused to blurb it until they sent me the index. So I got to read that too. And that's the best. I don't mean to say it was the best part, but certainly everything seemed to lead up to the index and it was a great part. But my question after reading it was I was always looking for a reference to that thing I grew up with called the index, which in the Catholic Church was a list of movies you weren't allowed to see because they had sex in them. But I found no reference to the index according to the Catholic Church. And I'm just wondering, is that because you're all Protestants?
No, it's not. No, it's a really good question. A few people have asked that actually. The index prohibitorum librorum, the index of prohibited books, which was begun, I think, in the 1500s as a list of books that Catholics weren't allowed to read and might be sort of banned or taken off you, but it doesn't function as an index. I mean, the reason it's not there is because it has the same name, but it's a book list. It's like a library catalogue or something, rather than something that will help you navigate something. It's a list of prescribed texts, and I couldn't quite figure out whether I should mention it, but then the sort of category of index as a navigation tool, which is what I'm talking, the index as a search tool, isn't what's going on with the index of prohibited books. So Mary,
although that may be the way Mary used it.
Well, that makes sense. Only that was the first time I ever heard the word index.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
As a Catholic school
I have been taken to task for its absence a few times, so I probably should at least have put in, I shall not be discussing the index of prohibited.
Well,
but I did. Hey, listen, can I just say, Mary, thank you so much for, I just pointed to the blurb on the back and you said a lovely thing about it, but also you say Dennis's history along with Paula's peerless index. And it's certainly the first time that I've seen a book blurb that that names the indexer, and I'm so chuffed and grateful.
Yeah, so am I. Thank you, Mary.
It's a great book. I'll just give it another show here. Okay. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for writing it.
Oh, thank you, Mary.
All right. One more question. Indexes or indices?
Indexes.
Indexes.
All right, good. We're all in agreement with that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Dennis and Paula.
Can I just put a little plug in as well? If you want to know more about indexes, we've got National Indexing Day coming up at the end of March, which is 30th of March. #IndexDay on Twitter. There'll be indexers talking about different things to do with indexing, and share your favorite indexes. And it's something we invented because we should talk about them more. So.
That's awesome. That's so exciting. Oh man, thank you both for being here with us. This was so much fun, and we'll hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.